Great. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, is recognized to question the witnesses for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all to the ranking member, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to chat a little bit with you, Mr. Nutt. One of USAID's publicly stated missions is that the promotion of greater economic opportunities for women throughout the world. But in reality, the work that this administration has done and some of the policies that it's pushing for has been detrimental to women's prosperity and empowerment in a whole host of ways. There's a wealth of academic research showing us that gains in women's education and employment can be attributed to increasing access to contraceptions. That access has given millions of women control over their future and better enable them to participate in workforce and contribute both to local and global economies. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us how the policy priority that we have in our mission makes sense in regards to the proposed cuts to family planning that your department is putting forth.
I have not been briefed on that particular matter at this point. I know the administration, the administrators has been pushing an initiative to push out the implementation and the programs of USAID down to the more local level and to the betterment of people in country. But I can't speak to your immediate question, but I can take that question for the record.
Wonderful. Ms. Leavitt, did you have a?
As my colleague has answered, we'll gladly follow up with many details for that, details that will demonstrate the breadth and extent of our basic education programs and higher education programs around the world, and how in many cases they prioritize access to education to girls, to young women, how we advance entrepreneurial types of programs, economic livelihood types of programs in support of girls and women. So we have a wealth of programs that help advance.
No, that's well and dandy. My question was investment in family planning and the opportunities to have access to contraceptions, and how we know that that there is so much research that backs that gives families the ability to have advancement when the girls and the women in the family have an ability to earn an education and enter the workforce.
And we look forward to following up with you with a detailed follow-up.
Wonderful. Ambassador, I wanted to follow up with Mr. Liu's questions earlier in diversity in hiring, promotion, and retention. You mentioned earlier that you wanted to take a broad definition of diversity, and I wanted to see who's included within that definition. Are we including people with disabilities? Okay. Is that a yes?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman. Yes, that is
okay.
Yes.
Does that include the LGBT community?
Yes, it does.
Does it include religious minorities?
Religious minorities are protected under the Civil Rights Code, so yes.
And are we currently collecting that data for these categories?
So the data collection is done on a volunteer basis, which has always been one of the struggles. People have to self-identify, and we do not, I believe, collect on all this. I will have to get back to you, Congresswoman, because I'm not sure about some.
Yeah. Do you think
categories.
It's helpful for us to collect this data? Does that inform us in some sort of way to make sure that we are able to diversify and promote and retain people?
I think sometimes it would. For example, I chair the committee that looks at assignments to principal officer positions and deputy chief of mission positions. And one of the things we look at is diversity. Are we making sure that we have the most diverse slate of candidates for every position? Now, 12 people sit on the committee. These are senior level jobs. We tend to know a lot of people. We're not that big. So sometimes we know somebody's diverse, but then it may show up on their profile because they've opted not to do that. So we've left it up to the individual. I think sometimes that does could hurt the statistics, of course. And sometimes it's just someone at the table who says, listen, I know that this candidate is a diverse candidate, but we do not have something in place. I'm sort of on the fence. I don't want to necessarily push somebody, but yes, does it hurt people sometimes? And obviously we don't have a really accurate record.
No, I appreciate that, and I hope that we're able to look at it, because the reason I ask is that I anecdotally hear Muslims leaving this department because of this administration's perceived hostility towards the Muslim community or the LGBTQ community, leaving because of that perceived hostility. And so I want to make sure that we have the relevant data in regards to retention, and see if there are ways that we can make sure that we're dealing with that as we go forth.
And those that you mentioned are some of the most difficult because it's not so obvious. And so I think that's also an issue. What I would say more generally is that our attrition rates are not very high.
Yeah.
And they are trending on historical levels. So for our entry level, I'm talking foreign service now, that's civil service,
right.
It is 2%. At the mid levels is about 4%. Where you see the spike is when you get to the senior levels, but you have people that age out. We have a system, it's an up and out system, so they have time and class limitations, time and service limitations. We have not seen much of a difference. I know I've looked at the gender issues, but we do keep an eye on that to make sure that if there's anything that goes wrong. Again, it's trying to understand what the barriers are and making the workforce aware of inclusion. As I said, I think once you're in the door, then I think the inclusion is so important.
Yeah.
So to making sure that people are aware of what they do and their actions and how that affects inclusion.
Right. I appreciate that, and I hope we will have a follow-up conversation on this, because I think it's important for us to have clear protections put in place for religious minorities and other vulnerable communities, so that they are able to fully participate in every single department within this administration. And I hope that we are able to have the opportunity for us to get the answers that to the questions I'd asked in regards to family planning and how that feeds into the broader mission of your department. Thank you. I yield back.
Had a hearing a few weeks ago, first in this series on white supremacy and its growing role in the United States right now. And at this hearing, we discovered through expert witness testimony that not all of these incidents seem to be treated with the similar consistency. But we've also heard from experts that whether the FBI classifies extremist violence as, quote, domestic terrorism or a hate crime has major implications on resource allocation and prioritization within the Bureau. Mr. McGarity, the FBI considers preventing terrorism its #1 priority. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And Mr. Shivers, what about civil rights violations, such as hate crimes? How do they rank among the FBI priorities?
Within the civil rights program, it is the #1 priority.
So within the civil rights program, but the FBI overall, doesn't it seem that FBI agents would have more of an incentive to pursue domestic terrorism cases over hate crime cases?
Well, again, sometimes those cases overlap. And so in a number of instances, you may have a civil rights investigation and a domestic terrorism investigation open.
And I do see here that the civil rights program policy instructs agents to open parallel terrorism investigations whenever a suspect of a hate crime has any nexus to a white supremacist group, correct?
Correct.
We've seen white supremacist attacks that were clearly domestic terrorism. Experts, in fact, the acting AG, Jeff Sessions, even called some of these incidents domestic terrorism incidents. The Emmanuel AME Church shooting of Black Americans in Charleston and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh of Jewish people, those were only designated and charged as hate crimes, not domestic terrorist incidents. Mr. McGarity, why did the FBI not believe that these incidents were domestic terrorist incidents?
That's not correct. I don't know who told you that we didn't, but we certainly had cases open on them in both those cases, and I wasn't here for the Dylan Roof case. but it's certainly in our own Department of Justice Civil Rights about 3-4 weeks ago in their testimony actually stated that it was a domestic terrorism event charged through the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice for a hate crime. I was here for the Tree of Life. I will tell you, I remember that day distinctly. It was worked as both a domestic terrorism case and a hate crimes case, and it still worked that way.
And so you are disputing that the AME, you're saying that AME was charged with domestic terrorism, Dylan Roof.
So you're using the word charge. So as I said before, there's no domestic terrorism charge like 18 U.S.C. 2339 A, B, C, D for a foreign terrorist organization. So what we do, both on the international terrorism side with homegrown violent extremists and domestic terrorists, we'll use any tool in the toolkit to arrest them, hopefully left of attack. Should it be after, likely that hate crime statute will come to play through the Civil Rights Division as a charge because it's a good federal charge for us to use.
And the Tree of Life
shouldn't be stated that it's not a domestic terrorism. In fact, on the record, it's stated it's a domestic terrorism.
and the same thing with the synagogue shooting?
Yes.
So you're okay. So we have two conflicting testimonies.
Well, I mean, I can go back to May 8th, 2019 from the Department of Justice on the record. That statement called it domestic terrorism cases involving civil rights charges too, including some of the most serious attacks in recent years. Dylan Roof, African American parishioners engaged at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church, James Field at the Unite to Right rally in Virginia, and then also Robert Bowers.
So that's the
all
statement.
three events
but,
were domestic terrorism.
But the actual charge was the actual charge domestic terrorism?
You're not going to find an actual charge of domestic terrorism out there. If you look at Title 18, right? If you're looking for...
Well, it says here that, but at the San Bernardino shooting or the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, they were designated and charged as domestic terrorist incidents.
They were charged, I'd have to go back and look, they were charged likely with, if there was a connection to a foreign terrorist organization, it would likely fall under 18 U.S.C. 23 A or B.
So because the perpetrator was Muslim, they are... Doesn't it seem that because the perpetrator is Muslim,
that's not correct. That has nothing
that
to do,
the designation would say it's a foreign
No,
organization?
it's not correct. That is not correct.